"All right," he said softly, almost bored. "You gonna scream, or you gonna behave?" The laugh that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It came from somewhere behind him, somewhere in the crowd, and it carried the weight of people who already knew how this usually ended. Her back pressed harder into the cold concrete pillar, as if the building itself might step in where no one else had. The cafeteria smelled like reheated pizza and bleach, fluorescent lights humming overhead, trays clattering, conversations blurring into noise that suddenly felt very far away. "Stop," she said. The word came out thin, not because she lacked strength, but because shock had stolen the air from her lungs. Her hands hovered uselessly at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling, brain scrambling to catch up with what was happening in front of dozens of people who pretended not to see. He leaned in closer, varsity jacket bright against the dull institutional walls, his grin easy and practiced. He wasn't rushed. He never was. That was the worst part. The way he treated this like entertainment, like he had time. "Relax," he murmured. "It's just a joke." Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Her heart hammered so loud she wondered if anyone else could hear it. She scanned the room instinctively, searching for a face that might change, for eyes that might lock onto hers and decide to act. Most looked away. Some stared openly. A few smirked, feeding off the energy of the moment without ever stepping into it. And somewhere, at the edge of all that noise, a chair scraped against the floor. No one noticed yet. Not him, not her. But something had shifted, and once it did, there was no going back. Chapter 1. The first thing she noticed about the cafeteria wasn't the people. It was the sound. A constant, droning echo of voices bouncing off tile and glass, layered with the mechanical hum of lights that never fully shut off. It was the kind of place where privacy went to die, where everything felt exposed even when nothing was happening. On her first day, she told herself, that was fine. Exposure meant visibility. Visibility meant opportunity. She stood near the pillar, because it gave her something solid at her back. Old habit. Years of training had taught her to be aware of space, exits, blind spots. Even now, in workout gear and camouflage pants, her posture was alert without being aggressive, shoulders squared, feet planted. Anyone looking closely would have seen it, the way she carried herself, the quiet discipline in her movements. But most people didn't look closely. They saw what they expected to see. The new girl. She'd transferred mid-semester, which always came with whispers. No one asked why directly. They never did. They filled in the gaps themselves. Some assumed trouble, others assumed weakness. Almost all assumed she wouldn't last. She grabbed her tray, nodded politely at the cafeteria worker, and scanned for an open seat. Tables were packed in clusters, social lines already drawn and enforced without words. Athletes here, honors kids there. A group laughing too loud in the corner. She spotted an empty chair near the center aisle and moved toward it, keeping her gaze forward, breathing steady. That was when she felt it. Not the touch, yet, but the shift. The way the air changes when someone steps into your space without permission. "Hey," a voice said. She turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge him without fully facing him. He was taller, broad-shouldered, the kind of confidence that came from knowing people would back him up. The varsity jacket wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. It was a signal, a uniform. "Yes?" she said, calm, neutral. He smiled like he'd already won something. "You're new, I know." A few chuckles rippled from behind him. His friends, always nearby, always just far enough away to pretend they weren't involved. "You don't talk much," he said. "I'm here to eat." That should have been the end of it. In a normal place it would have been, but normal didn't apply here, not when power was currency and boredom made people cruel. He stepped closer. Too close. She shifted her weight instinctively, angling her body, keeping her tray level. Her eyes flicked to the exits again, not in fear, but assessment. She told herself not to overreact. She'd dealt with worse than smug teenagers in a cafeteria. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. Giving it felt like handing over leverage. "Yeah, and I don't give it out to strangers." That was when his grin tightened, just slightly. The moment the joke stopped being a joke. "You think you're better than us?" he asked, loud enough now that nearby conversations dipped. "No," she said. "I think I'm busy." She tried to step past him. That was the mistake, not because she was wrong, but because he wasn't used to being bypassed. His arm shot out, blocking her path, his hand brushing against her tray. Milk sloshed dangerously close to the edge. "Watch it," he said, though he was the one who'd moved. Her pulse spiked. Around them the crowd sensed it too, that invisible tightening, like everyone leaning in without moving. "Move," she said quietly. He laughed. "You got an attitude, and you're in my way." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation that she wasn't playing the role he'd assigned her. He leaned in again, voice dropping. "Careful," he said. "People don't like girls who don't know their place." That word, place, landed heavier than the rest. Her jaw clenched. Memories she hadn't invited stirred at the edges of her mind. Training grounds, locker rooms, moments where silence had been the safer option. She swallowed it down. "I know exactly where I am," she said, "and you're done." She tried again to move. This time his hand didn't stop at blocking her path. Chapter 2. The contact was brief, almost casual. That was what made it worse. The way he treated it like nothing, like her body was just another object in the space he controlled. Her back hit the pillar harder than she expected, the concrete cold even through fabric. The tray clattered to the floor, plastic echoing loudly, drawing every eye in the room at once. Time did that strange stretching thing. Sounds sharpened, faces blurred. "Whoa," someone said, half laughing. "Relax," he said again, hands up in mock innocence. She tripped. She didn't respond right away. Her mind raced through options, consequences. Fight back and become the problem. Stay still and let it continue. Her breathing went shallow, not from fear, but from anger she was fighting to keep contained. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. "Back up," she said. He didn't. Instead, he leaned in, close enough that she could smell cologne and cafeteria grease. His voice dropped, meant only for her, though everyone knew what was happening. "You embarrassed me," he said. "That's not smart." Her eyes darted again, searching the crowd. A girl at a nearby table looked down at her phone. A guy shifted uncomfortably but stayed seated. No one stepped forward. The silence was loud, suffocating. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. It was the public nature of it, the understanding that whatever happened next would define her here. New girl, trouble, victim, fighter. Labels waiting to snap into place. "Let me go," she said, firmer now. He smirked. "Or what?" That was the question, wasn't it? Or what? Because he knew the rules as well as she did. He knew how quickly blame traveled, how easily stories bent. He had witnesses, he had history, she had none of that here. A flicker of movement caught her eye. The scraping chair again, louder this time. Somewhere behind the crowd a man stood, older, broader, not dressed like the rest. He didn't rush, he didn't shout. He just watched, eyes sharp, posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than passivity. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. But something in his stillness steadied her. Just enough. The bully noticed it too, glancing over his shoulder, annoyed. "What?" he snapped, then turned back to her, irritation creeping into his voice. "You think someone's coming to save you?" She met his gaze, chest rising and falling. "I think you should stop." The room held its breath. He laughed again, but it sounded thinner this time. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get to tell me what to do." In that moment, the power imbalance was absolute. Him standing, crowd-backed, untouchable, her pinned, isolated, every move scrutinized, and yet beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, something else burned. Resolve. The quiet kind that didn't announce itself, that waited. The man in the background took a step forward. No one noticed yet, but the moment had already crossed a line, and lines, once crossed, demand answers. The chair scraped again, unmistakable this time. Not loud enough to command the room, but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a blade against stone. The sound didn't belong to the usual cafeteria chaos. It had intention behind it, the kind that comes from someone who has already decided something. The bully glanced back, irritation flashing across his face, then returned his attention to her, as if daring the interruption to matter. His hand still hovered too close, not touching now, but close enough to remind her that he could. That reminder sat heavy in her chest. "Look at you," he said, voice low, smug. "Acting tough. You think people are scared of you?" She didn't answer. She focused on her breathing, slow and controlled, the way she'd been taught long before this place, long before fluorescent lights and plastic trays. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Panic wasted energy. Panic made mistakes. Behind him, the man took another step forward. He didn't fit the environment. That was the first thing anyone would notice if they were paying attention. No backpack, no school colors, plain dark shirt, worn boots. His posture was loose but not careless, every movement economical, as if he'd learned long ago that unnecessary motion was a liability. He scanned the room quickly, noting exits, distances, reactions. Old habits never really died. He'd come in for a late lunch, nothing more. Grab a sandwich, sit quietly, kill time before an appointment across town. He'd chosen a table near the wall out of instinct, back to something solid. He noticed things, always had. At first he'd registered the commotion as background noise. Teenagers posturing, voices raised. It happened everywhere. But then he'd seen her face. Not fear exactly. Shock, yes. Anger held tightly in check. And something else beneath it. Discipline. The kind that didn't belong in this setting. The kind you didn't learn from gym class or social media clips. The kind forged somewhere harsher. He'd watched long enough to know this wasn't mutual. Power flowed one way here, and it wasn't subtle. The bully shifted closer to her again, invading space like it was a game. "Say something," he pressed. "Or you gonna cry?" That did it. "Hey," the man said. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive. But it carried. The room didn't go silent, not completely, but the sound dipped, like a wave pulling back. The bully turned fully this time, annoyance clear. "Mind your business." The man stepped into clearer view now, stopping a few feet away. He didn't square up. He didn't puff his chest. He just stood there, eyes steady, voice even. "I am," he said. "Now." A few students shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of the script they were used to. Adults usually came in loud or not at all. This man did neither. The bully laughed, though it came out forced. "She's fine. You some kind of hero?" The man glanced at her just once, not in a way that asked permission, in a way that checked. She met his eyes, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was acknowledging presence. "That's not what this is," the man said, turning back. "Step away from her." The bully scoffed. "Or what?" The question echoed again, heavier now. "Or what?" It was the same challenge he'd thrown at her, thrown at teachers, thrown at anyone who'd ever tested him and backed down. He expected the same outcome here. The man exhaled slowly. "Or you're going to learn something today you won't enjoy." There it was. Not a threat. A statement. The bully's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. He recovered quickly, puffing up, crowd behind him lending false courage. "You touch me, You won't," the man interrupted calmly. "Because if you were going to do something, you'd have done it already." That landed, harder than shouting ever could. The room felt different now. Not safer yet, but altered. Like gravity had shifted just enough to be noticeable. She slid a step sideways, no longer pinned. No one stopped her, and for the first time since it began, the bully hesitated. Chapter 4. Hesitation was not something the bully was familiar with. It felt wrong, like wearing shoes on the wrong feet. His confidence had always been automatic, fed by laughter, by silence, by the unspoken agreement that he could do what he wanted and walk away clean. That agreement was fraying now, right in front of him. "You think you scare me?" he snapped, though his voice had risen, betrayed him. "This isn't your school." The man nodded once. "I know." That answer confused him. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't reactive, it was factual. And it made him uneasy in a way he didn't know how to name. Around them, the crowd had shifted from passive entertainment to something closer to uncertainty. Phones were still out, but hands trembled. People whispered. This was new territory, an adult who wasn't playing by the usual rules. A situation that didn't resolve neatly. She stood a few feet away now, rubbing her wrist where adrenaline still buzzed under the skin. Her heart hadn't slowed, but her mind had sharpened. She watched the man carefully, recognizing patterns. The way he positioned himself between her and the bully without making a show of it. The way his weight stayed balanced, ready. She'd seen that before, not here, somewhere else. The bully took a step forward, then stopped when the man didn't move back. Their proximity was close enough now that the difference between them became obvious. Not size, presence. One was loud, the other didn't need to be. "You don't know who I am," the bully said, trying again to reclaim ground. "I know exactly who you are," the man replied. "You're someone who thinks witnesses are protection." A murmur rippled through the room. That hit a nerve, because it named the truth everyone understood but never said. The bully thrived on crowds, on shared guilt, on diffusion of responsibility. "Touch her again," the man continued, voice still level, "and every set of eyes in here becomes a problem for you, not a shield." The bully glanced around. Faces looked back at him now, not all amused, some curious, some uneasy, some already distancing themselves, inching chairs back, signaling they didn't want to be part of this anymore. "You can't do anything," he said, but it sounded hollow. "You don't even belong here." The man smiled slightly, not with humor but recognition. "I belong anywhere someone decides to hurt another person in public." That was the moment the weight of the situation settled in, not just for the bully but for everyone watching. This wasn't about rules or authority or who had the loudest voice. It was about accountability, immediate and unavoidable. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, validation, the quiet confirmation that what she'd felt was real, that this wasn't her overreacting or misunderstanding. Someone else saw it too. A cafeteria monitor appeared at the edge of the room, drawn by the tension. "What's going on?" she asked, uncertain, already overwhelmed. The bully opened his mouth, ready to spin it. The man spoke first. He blocked her, pushed her, and refused to let her leave, he said. Clear, precise, no embellishment. The monitor blinked, looked at the spilled tray, the pillar, the space between bodies, evidence she hadn't wanted to see but couldn't ignore. "Is that true?" she asked the bully. He hesitated again. Just a beat too long. The answer didn't matter anymore. She stepped forward, voice firmer now. "I want to file a report." The bully spun toward her, eyes wide. "You can't." "I can," she said, steady, "and I am." The man took a step back, giving space now that it was no longer needed. His role was done for the moment. Intervention wasn't about dominance. It was about restoring balance. As staff began moving, as murmurs grew louder, she met the man's eyes again. Gratitude flickered there, unspoken but clear. He nodded once, subtle. Then he turned away, already fading back into the background. But nothing in that room would return to how it was before, because power had been challenged. And once that happens, consequences follow. The hallway outside the cafeteria felt colder than it should have. The same fluorescent lights followed her, but here they hummed louder, harsher, like they were no longer pretending to be neutral. She walked beside the cafeteria monitor, her steps steady even though her legs still carried the echo of adrenaline. Behind them, the bully trailed with two administrators now, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched. The crowd they left behind buzzed like a disturbed hive, speculation already spreading faster than truth ever did. She kept her eyes forward. That was the first lesson she'd learned years ago, long before this building, long before this town. When pressure comes, you don't look back for approval. You don't scan faces for comfort. You keep moving, one step at a time, because momentum is protection. Inside the small administrative office, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of paper and old coffee. A desk lamp cast a yellow pool of light that felt too intimate for what was about to be discussed. The monitor gestured for her to sit. She did, hands folded loosely in her lap, posture upright. Calm wasn't weakness. Calm was control. "Tell us what happened," one of the administrators said, already opening a folder. She spoke clearly. No drama. No exaggeration. She described the blocked path, the unwanted contact, the refusal to let her leave. She named the feeling without letting it swallow her. That took effort. It always did. But she understood something many people didn't. Emotional clarity carried more weight than emotional volume. As she spoke, the bully shifted in his chair, scoffing softly, shaking his head as if bored. It was a performance, one that had worked before. "That's not how it went," he cut in. She was rude. I was joking. Everyone saw it. The administrator raised a hand. "You'll have your turn." He leaned back, arms crossed, trying to reclaim space. But the room wasn't a cafeteria. There was no crowd to hide in here, no laughter to cushion him. And when I asked him to move, she continued, "He escalated. He used his body to stop me." Silence settled. The administrator looked at the spilled tray photo already pulled up on a tablet, snapped by someone and forwarded. Evidence had a way of stripping stories down to their bones. "We have multiple witnesses," the administrator said carefully. "Some corroborate your account." The bully's head snapped up. "Who? That's not relevant right now." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear yet. Calculation. He was realizing this wasn't ending the way it usually did. Outside the office, through the narrow window in the door, she saw the man again. The one who had stepped in. He stood with his arms relaxed at his sides, speaking quietly to another staff member. He didn't look anxious. He didn't look triumphant. He looked resolved, like someone who had done this kind of thing before and knew exactly when to step forward and when to step back. The administrator followed her gaze briefly, then returned to his notes. "We're taking this seriously," he said. "You did the right thing by reporting." Those words landed heavier than she expected, not because she needed reassurance, but because so few people ever said them out loud. The bully snorted. "This is ridiculous." The administrator looked at him sharply. "What's ridiculous is your behavior." The sentence hung there, undeniable. She felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not victory, something quieter. Validation mixed with exhaustion. Standing up cost energy. Always had, but it was still worth it. As the meeting wrapped up, the administrator outlined next steps. Formal investigation. Temporary suspension from extracurriculars, mandatory review of conduct, consequences that would ripple beyond this room. The bully's bravado cracked, just slightly. "This is going to ruin my record." The administrator didn't soften. That's something you should have considered earlier. She stood when dismissed, smoothing her shirt, grounding herself in the physical motion. As she reached the door, the man caught her eye again. This time he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not pride, recognition. Outside, the hallway felt different. Same lights, same walls. But she walked taller now, not because she'd won, but because she hadn't folded. And sometimes, in places like this, that mattered more. Chapter 6. News traveled fast. By the end of the day, versions of the story had already mutated, stretched, bent to fit whoever was telling it. Some said she'd overreacted. Others said the bully had finally pushed too far. A few exaggerated the intervention, turning the man into something larger than life, because people liked their heroes clean and dramatic. She ignored it all. That night, alone in her small apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall long after the sun had gone down. The silence pressed in, heavier than the cafeteria ever had. This was the part no one filmed, the aftermath, the questions that crept in when adrenaline faded. Had she handled it right? Would things get worse before they got better? Would this define her here, whether she wanted it to or not? She closed her eyes and breathed. Across town, the man sat at his own kitchen table, a half-eaten meal cooling in front of him. He replayed the scene in his head, not because he doubted his actions, but because reflection was habit. Years of service had wired him that way. After-action reviews, they called it. What went right? What went wrong? What could be better next time? He knew he'd crossed an invisible line today, not legally, not morally, but socially. Intervening in public situations always carried risk. Escalation, misinterpretation, retaliation. He'd weighed it all in seconds and stepped in anyway, because some moments didn't wait for perfect conditions. The next morning, the cafeteria felt like a different battlefield. People glanced at her openly now. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact. A few offered quiet words of support, awkward but sincere. One girl muttered, "That was brave," as she passed. Brave. She wasn't sure about that. She'd been angry. She'd been cornered. She'd acted. The bully wasn't there. His absence was loud. Chairs sat empty where he usually held court. The space felt lighter, not safe yet, but less oppressive. She spotted the man near the back again, eating quietly, alone. He caught her eye and gestured subtly toward an empty chair across from him, an invitation without pressure. She hesitated only a moment before joining him. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. "You handled yourself. That could have gone bad." "It could have," he agreed. "But it didn't, because you didn't back down." She studied him then, really looked, the calm, the awareness, the scars he didn't talk about but carried anyway. "You military?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Something like that." They ate in companionable silence for a moment, the noise of the room flowing around them. Finally he spoke again. "You know," he said, "most people don't step in because they're afraid of becoming the story." She considered that. "And most bullies count on that." He met her gaze. "Exactly. The conversation didn't last long. It didn't need to. Some connections weren't meant to linger. They existed to reinforce something important, then fade." As she stood to leave, she felt steadier than she had in weeks. The system hadn't magically fixed itself. People hadn't suddenly become kinder, but a line had been drawn, publicly and clearly. For the first time since arriving, she believed something fundamental, that her presence here didn't require permission, and that belief changed everything. By the third day, the story had stopped being about what happened and started being about what it meant. That shift mattered more than anyone realized at first. In the halls, conversations lowered when she passed, not out of fear, but awareness. People were recalibrating. They were asking themselves quiet questions they'd avoided before. What would I have done? Why didn't I do anything? Would I step in next time, or would I keep my head down like always? Those questions had weight, and weight changes behavior. She felt it most in the small moments. A chair pulled out for her without ceremony. A classmate asking her opinion and actually listening to the answer. These weren't grand gestures, they were adjustments, subtle, human ones, the kind that happen when a system gets nudged off autopilot. But not everyone adjusted in healthy ways. By the end of the week, she started noticing the looks, the ones that weren't supportive or neutral, but resentful, the kind that said, "You disrupted something comfortable, not for you, but for us." Those looks came mostly from people who had benefited from silence, people who'd laughed before, people who'd filmed instead of intervened. She understood them better than they understood themselves. Change always exposed those who thrived in the old order. One afternoon she sat alone in the gym, stretching after a workout. Physical exertion was still her anchor. Muscles didn't lie. They responded to effort honestly, without politics or rumor. Sweat grounded her in ways conversation never could. As she reached for her water bottle, her phone buzzed. A notification. Then another, screenshots forwarded from someone she barely knew. A group chat. Not subtle, not private enough. She played the victim. Dude was just joking. Now we gotta watch everything we say. Her thumb hovered over the screen. The familiar pull rose up. The urge to defend, to explain, to justify. She resisted it. Not because she was weak, but because she was learning something deeper. Not every accusation deserved a response. Not every narrative could be corrected. And not every silence was surrender. Across town, the man sat in his truck, parked outside a hardware store, engine off. He hadn't meant to run into this again, hadn't planned to stay in the area long, but he delayed his departure more than once this week, something that irritated him enough to force reflection. He'd spent years in environments where bullying took different shapes: rank, power, unspoken rules enforced through humiliation rather than fists. He'd seen what happened when good people stayed quiet. He'd lived with the outcomes of moments when someone should have stepped in and didn't. That was why the cafeteria scene hadn't felt optional to him. But what lingered now wasn't the confrontation. It was the aftershock, the way systems resisted correction, the way individuals bore the cost of collective cowardice. He wondered how she was holding up. The answer came sooner than expected. The following morning, he watched from a distance as she walked into the building. Her posture was the same, upright, composed, but something about her eyes had hardened, not in a bitter way, in a focused one. She wasn't just surviving this anymore. She was processing it. And processing led to decisions. By lunchtime, a rumor reached her that the Bullies' suspension had been extended pending review, that his coach had benched him indefinitely, that college scouts were suddenly reconsidering character concerns. The rumor wasn't entirely accurate, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that consequences were no longer theoretical. That afternoon she was called into another meeting, this time not about the incident itself, but about what came next. Restorative practices, policy reviews, assemblies about conduct and bystander responsibility, the institution trying to retrofit ethics after the fact. As she listened, she realized something unsettling. They were grateful, but they were also afraid. Afraid of lawsuits, afraid of headlines, afraid of admitting how long this behavior had gone unchecked. When they asked her to speak at a student forum, she hesitated. Public visibility came at a cost. She asked for time. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the question looping. Speak and risk being defined by this forever. Stay quiet and let the moment pass. She thought of the cafeteria, the pillar, the crowd. She thought of how close she'd come to walking away. By morning, she had her answer. Chapter 8. The forum filled faster than expected. Students packed the auditorium, spilling into aisles, leaning against walls. Faculty lined the back, arms crossed, expressions cautious. This wasn't scheduled as an event. It had become one. The difference mattered. She stood backstage, fingers flexing unconsciously, grounding herself. She wasn't afraid of speaking. She was afraid of being misunderstood, of having her experience reduced to a soundbite, of becoming symbolic when she was still very human. The man sat near the exit, where he could see the room without being seen himself. Old habits again. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't asked permission. He just showed up. Not to intervene this time, but to witness. When her name was called, the applause surprised her. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't performative. It was hesitant, building, unsure of itself. Honest. She stepped into the light. For a moment she said nothing. Silence stretched, uncomfortable and necessary. "I'm not here to be inspirational," she began, her voice carried without strain. "I'm here because something happened that could have happened to anyone." A murmur rippled through the room. She didn't describe the incident in detail. She didn't need to. Most people already knew the outline. Instead, she spoke about the moment after, the waiting, the realization that everyone was watching, and no one was moving. "That part," she said, "that's what stays with you." She paused, letting that land. People think bullying is about strength versus weakness. It's not. It's about permission. And permission doesn't come from one person. It comes from the room. That was the turning point. You could feel it, the collective shift, the discomfort blooming where denial had lived. She talked about silence, not as evil, but as habit, about how easy it was to rationalize inaction, about how she herself had once looked away in other situations, convinced it wasn't her place. "I learned something that day," she said. "You don't need to be loud to interrupt harm. You just need to be present." Her eyes scanned the room, not accusing, but inviting. "When someone stepped in for me, it didn't erase what happened, but it changed what happened next." In the back, the man lowered his gaze, uncomfortable with recognition but unable to deny the truth of it. She finished without a flourish. No dramatic call to action, just a final sentence. "Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged," she said. "It changes hands." The room was silent when she stepped off stage. Then the applause came, not hesitant this time, sustained, heavy. But what mattered wasn't the sound. It was the aftermath. In the days that followed, reports increased, not just of bullying, but of intervention. Students stepping in, saying something, sitting down next to someone who was being targeted. The culture didn't transform overnight, but it cracked, and cracks let light in. For her, the change was internal. She no longer flinched when entering the cafeteria. She no longer scanned for exits first. She still noticed them. Old habits never fully faded, but they weren't the focus anymore. She noticed people instead. The man left town 2 days later. No goodbye, no exchange of numbers. That wasn't the kind of connection this was. But as he drove, he carried something with him that surprised him: hope. Not the naive kind, the earned kind. The kind that comes when someone chooses growth over comfort, and a room full of witnesses decides, maybe for the first time, not to look away. And from that point on, the story could never go back to what it was before. The weeks after the forum didn't feel dramatic. There were no sweeping announcements, no viral clips that wrapped everything up neatly. What there was instead were moments, small, uneven human moments, where the old rules hesitated and the new ones struggled to take shape. She felt it walking through the cafeteria again, the same tables, the same smell of reheated food. But the energy had shifted, not softened, just altered. Conversations paused when someone raised their voice too sharply. Laughter died quicker when it edged toward cruelty. It wasn't that bullying vanished. It was that it no longer moved unchecked. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, she watched a freshman hesitate at the drink station, tray shaking slightly as a group of upperclassmen crowded too close. Normally, she would have kept moving. Normally, she would have told herself it wasn't her fight. Instead, she stopped. "You want this spot?" she asked casually, meeting the freshman's eyes. The kid nodded, relief flooding his face. She stepped aside deliberately, creating space. The upperclassman grumbled but moved on. No confrontation, no spectacle, just interruption. She realized then that intervention didn't always look like courage. Sometimes it looked like inconvenience. And people hated being inconvenienced when their power depended on momentum. Word spread quietly that she was someone who noticed things, not in a threatening way, in a steady way. That reputation changed how people behaved around her. Not because they feared her, but because awareness itself disrupted patterns. But there were costs. Anonymous messages appeared in her inbox late at night, some supportive, some bitter. A few venomous enough to make her pause. She didn't share them, not with administrators, not with friends. She understood something most people learned too late: systems were slow, and healing didn't come from handing every wound to authority. What did help was routine. She ran every morning before classes, lungs burning, feet pounding pavement, letting motion burn off the residue of other people's projections. She lifted in the afternoons, letting her body remind her that strength wasn't theoretical. It was built rep by rep, choice by choice. Across town, the bully sat in his childhood bedroom, posters still on the wall, trophies collecting dust. His days were suddenly empty, practices canceled, friends distant, conversations awkward. He scrolled endlessly, watching other people live versions of the future he'd assumed was guaranteed. At first, he blamed her. Easily, completely. That story fit. It protected him. But isolation has a way of eroding lies. He replayed the cafeteria scene too, though differently, not as humiliation but as confusion. The moment when laughter didn't land, when the room turned, when an adult didn't back down. No one had ever held a mirror up like that before. He wasn't remorseful yet, but he was uncomfortable, and discomfort was new territory. At school, administrators rolled out new initiatives, workshops, posters, policies written in careful language. Some students rolled their eyes, others listened, most hovered somewhere in between. She didn't expect institutions to change overnight. Institutions were slow by design, but she did notice something else: students talking to each other differently. Less bravado, more caution, less certainty that silence would always protect them. That shift wasn't policy-driven, it was cultural. One evening, she received an email asking if she'd considered joining a student advisory group on campus climate. She stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Leadership came with visibility. Visibility came with risk. She replied yes anyway, not because she wanted the role, but because she knew what happened when people who cared declined to step in. Chapter 10. The first advisory meeting was messy. People talked over each other. Some minimized the problem, others exaggerated it. A few tried to redirect the conversation towards safer topics. It was democracy in its most frustrating form. Inefficient, emotional, imperfect. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she chose precision over passion. She talked about patterns, not individuals. About environments, not villains. About how bullying thrived in ambiguity and shrank under clarity. "You don't need more rules," she said at one point. "You need fewer blind spots." That sentence stuck. Over the following weeks, blind spots started getting named. Locker rooms, group chats, hallways between classes where no adults lingered. Places where behavior changed the moment oversight disappeared. Students volunteered to rotate presence in those spaces, not as enforcers, as witnesses. The idea was simple and radical: visibility as prevention. Outside that room, life continued unevenly. Some days she felt empowered. Other days, she felt exhausted, the weight of expectation pressing heavier than the original incident ever had. Being a symbol was draining. People projected strength onto her that she didn't always feel. One night, she broke down crying in her car after a long meeting, the tears sudden and embarrassing, not because of what anyone said, but because she was tired of being the one who handled it well. Handling things well didn't make you immune to hurt, it just delayed it. She let herself feel it this time, the anger, the grief, the unfairness of having to grow because someone else chose harm. That release mattered. Across town, the bully sat in a mandatory counseling session, arms crossed, jaw tight. He gave short answers. Deflected. Blamed. But the counselor didn't push. She waited. Eventually, silence did what confrontation couldn't. "You ever think about why you needed an audience?" she asked quietly. The question landed differently than accusations ever had. He didn't answer. Not out loud. But something shifted. Back at school, the cafeteria monitor stopped her one morning. "Things feel different," she said cautiously. "They are," she replied, "but different isn't the same as fixed." She understood now that progress was fragile. It required maintenance, attention, people willing to stay engaged even when the spotlight moved on. She also understood her limits. She wasn't responsible for saving everyone. She was responsible for herself first, for choosing when to step forward and when to rest. That balance was new and necessary. As winter crept in, the campus settled into a quieter rhythm. Fewer incidents, fewer whispers. Not because harm disappeared, but because it was interrupted earlier, more often. One afternoon, as she left the gym, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. Strong, tired, grounded. She smiled faintly. Not because the story was over, but because it was finally moving forward. By the time spring arrived, the campus looked the same but functioned differently. That was the strange part. Change rarely announced itself with banners or speeches. It showed up in posture, in timing, in the way people paused before acting. She noticed it during a fire drill one afternoon. Hundreds of students funneled into the parking lot, clumped together in loosely organized chaos. Normally, this was where tempers flared, where jokes turned sharp and elbows flew under the cover of noise. Instead, she watched a group of seniors instinctively form a loose corridor so a student on crutches could pass through without being rushed. No applause followed, no one filmed it. It just happened. Moments like that stacked quietly. But progress never moved in a straight line. One Thursday morning, she received an email marked urgent. The subject line alone tightened her chest. A student advisory complaint had been filed against her. She read it slowly, twice. The language was careful, almost clinical. Accusations of overstepping, of creating a hostile environment for certain students, of misusing influence. No names attached, no specific incidents cited. Just implication. She sat back in her chair, letting the weight of it settle. This was the part no one talked about. The backlash that came not from the original harm, but from the discomfort of change. When people lost unearned power, they often reframed accountability as persecution. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. That weekend she barely slept. Not from fear of consequences. She knew she'd acted within every boundary, but from exhaustion. From the realization that doing the right thing didn't end conflict. It transformed it. At the meeting, she listened as administrators spoke in cautious tones, balancing optics with intent. They asked her to explain her approach, to clarify her role, to reassure them that she wasn't targeting anyone. She answered evenly, grounding herself in facts, in process, in consistency. She didn't apologize for impact she hadn't caused. She didn't grow defensive. She explained that safety and accountability weren't opposites. That discomfort wasn't harm. The room stayed quiet longer than expected after she finished. Finally, one administrator cleared his throat. "To be honest," he said, "we're not used to students initiating this level of engagement." She nodded. "I'm not used to needing to." That honesty shifted something. The complaint was dismissed, quietly. But the message lingered. Progress would always provoke resistance. Sometimes subtle, sometimes bureaucratic, always testing resolve. She left the building drained, shoulders heavy, wondering if the cost was finally outweighing the value. Later that day, as she sat on the bleachers watching the track team practice, a student she barely knew approached her, younger, nervous, hands shoved deep into hoodie pockets. "I heard about the meeting," the student said softly. She braced herself. "Yeah?" The student nodded. "I just wanted to say, I didn't report something earlier this year. I thought it wasn't bad enough, but after everything I did, and it got handled." Her throat tightened. "I'm glad." "Me too," the student said. "I just didn't want you thinking it wasn't working." After the student left, she stayed seated long after practice ended, long after the sun dipped low and the air cooled. That one sentence recalibrated something inside her. Working didn't always mean visible success. Sometimes it meant quieter harm that never escalated. Sometimes it meant outcomes she'd never witness. Across town, the bully stood outside a community center, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, staring at the door. Mandatory service hours, court-adjacent accountability disguised as opportunity. He hated it. Inside, he worked alongside people who didn't know his reputation, didn't care about his past dominance. Here, he was just another body stacking chairs, cleaning floors, taking instructions from people younger and older than him alike. The first weeks were miserable, humbling in all the wrong ways. Then something unexpected happened. No one here flinched around him. No one laughed at his jokes or deferred to him. No one feared him. Stripped of reaction, his behavior lost its shape. One afternoon, a volunteer supervisor corrected him sharply for cutting corners. The old reflex flared, anger, defensiveness, entitlement, but the supervisor didn't escalate, didn't argue, just waited. The silence stretched. Finally, the bully muttered, "Got it," and redid the task. It wasn't redemption, but it was friction, and friction created awareness. That night he dreamed of the cafeteria, not the shove, not the confrontation. The moment when laughter stopped, when the room turned. He woke unsettled, unsure why that moment mattered so much now. Chapter 12. Graduation season crept in quietly, disguised as deadlines and ceremonies and the subtle unraveling of routines people pretended would last forever. For her, the approaching transition felt less like an ending and more like a checkpoint. She wasn't leaving resolved, she was leaving aware. Her role on the advisory group was winding down. New members stepped in, carrying forward ideas she'd helped shape. Watching that happen stirred conflicting emotions: relief, pride, and an unexpected sense of grief. Letting go was its own discipline. At the final meeting, she spoke last. "I don't think culture changes because of policies," she said. "I think policies follow culture. And culture changes when ordinary people interrupt harm early." Heads nodded, notes scribbled, some faces skeptical, others intent. She didn't try to convince everyone. She didn't need to anymore. Outside the meeting room, she packed up her things, pausing to look at the scuffed table where so many difficult conversations had unfolded. She ran a hand over the surface, grounding herself in the tangible. Later that week, The campus hosted a small recognition event, not for her specifically, but for student leaders broadly. She stood in the back, uncomfortable with attention, content to let others take the spotlight. During the reception, she felt a familiar presence before she saw him. The man stood near the doorway, older than most in the room, posture unchanged. He didn't approach right away. When he did, it was with the same unassuming calm as before. "Looks like you built something that lasted," he said. She smiled, tired but genuine. "Looks like it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching clusters of students laugh, argue, plan futures they only half understood. "I almost quit," she admitted quietly. He nodded. "Most people do. Right before the impact they never get to see." She considered that. "You never asked me if I was okay." He met her gaze. "I figured you'd tell me if you weren't." That trust mattered more than reassurance ever could. Across town, the bully attended his final counseling session. He wasn't transformed, he wasn't absolved, but he was different, less certain, more reflective. That uncertainty unsettled him, but it also slowed him down. When asked what he'd learned, he hesitated longer than usual. "That attention isn't the same as respect," he said finally, "and once people stop laughing, you gotta face yourself." It wasn't eloquent. It wasn't complete, but it was honest. On her last day on campus, she returned to the cafeteria alone. Same pillar, same floor tiles. She stood there for a moment, letting memories surface without resistance. She wasn't reclaiming the space. She never needed to. She was acknowledging what it had taught her. That power, when unchallenged, spread quietly. That intervention didn't require heroism, just timing. That growth was messy, public, and rarely comfortable. As she walked out, she felt something settle into place, not closure. Continuity. Because stories like this didn't end, the twist didn't come with shouting or sudden violence. It came quietly, disguised as an email sent at 6:14 a.m., the kind of hour reserved for bad news or administrative panic. She read it standing in her kitchen, coffee untouched, phone vibrating faintly in her hand. The subject line was bland enough to be harmless. "Review update." It wasn't. The district had received an external complaint. Not from a student, not from a parent, from a donor. The message was careful, layered in legal language and concern for institutional reputation. It questioned whether recent disciplinary actions had been proportionate, whether unverified narratives had influenced policy shifts, whether the school had overcorrected in response to a single incident. Her name appeared once, not accused, referenced. That single word changed the temperature of the room. She sat down slowly, reading the email again, slower this time, parsing what wasn't being said. This wasn't about her conduct, it was about control, about influence exerted where it didn't belong, about someone with money deciding that accountability had gone far enough, maybe too far, when it started touching the wrong people. By noon, the advisory group was called into an emergency session. Faces looked tighter than usual. Administrators spoke in rehearsed phrases. The room smelled like stress and overbrewed coffee. "We're being asked to reassess," one of them said. "Not reverse anything. Reassess." Reassess was a coward's word. It meant retreat without admitting it. She listened, jaw tight, hands folded. When she spoke, it was deliberate. "If you reassess under pressure," she said, "you're teaching everyone exactly how power works here." Silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. An administrator sighed. "You don't understand the scale of this." She met his eyes. "I understand it perfectly. You're being asked to trade credibility for comfort." That landed harder than she expected. The meeting ended without resolution. That was the real danger. Uncertainty created space for erosion. Outside, whispers were already spreading. The bully's parents had hired someone. The suspension might be shortened, records adjusted, future prospects protected, the old system testing its strength. That afternoon she received a message she didn't expect. From him, the bully. The text was short, almost awkward. "Can we talk?" She stared at it for a long time. Every instinct screamed no. This wasn't her responsibility. She didn't owe him access. Engagement could be twisted, misrepresented, weaponized. And yet, something in the timing felt off. Not strategic, urgent. They met at a public coffee shop halfway between campus and the community center. Neutral ground, windows everywhere. He arrived early, sitting stiffly, hands wrapped around a cup he hadn't touched. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, internally. "I didn't file anything," he said immediately, voice low. "About the donor thing. That wasn't me." She believed him, not because she trusted him, but because guilt had a sound, and this wasn't it. "They're trying to clean it up," he continued. "My dad's friend. He thinks this all went too far." "And you?" she asked. He swallowed. I think I didn't know how much I was hiding behind other people." That was the first twist, not redemption, awareness. He looked up at her, eyes tired. "They're asking me to say it wasn't a big deal, that you exaggerated." Her chest tightened. And I can't," he said. "I tried, but I can't." That didn't erase anything he'd done. It didn't undo harm. But it complicated the story. Outside the coffee shop, rain began falling lightly, streaking the windows, blurring the edges of the world. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quickly. "I'm not even asking you to like me. I don't want to be that guy anymore." She studied him, measuring sincerity against pattern. She thought of the cafeteria, the silence, the laughter that had once protected him. "Then tell the truth," she said, "even if it costs you." He nodded slowly. "I think it already has." The second twist came 2 days later. The donor's complaint leaked, not publicly, internally, but enough. Faculty pushed back. Students caught wind. Alumni began asking questions. Quietly but insistently. Transparency, once cracked, spread. The administration tried to contain it, but containment required consensus, and that was gone. Too many people had seen what accountability looked like. Too many had benefited from it. A closed-door meeting turned heated. Words like integrity and precedent were used without irony. She wasn't invited to that one. She found out later that the deciding moment came from an unexpected voice. A junior administrator, usually silent, who asked a simple question. "If we undo this," she said, "who are we protecting, and from what?" No one answered. The donor withdrew the complaint the following morning, citing miscommunication. The suspension stood, the policies remained, the system didn't collapse, but it bent. That should have been the end of the twists. It wasn't. That evening she found an envelope slipped under her door, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "I was there. I didn't step in. I think about it every day. Thank you for forcing me to see myself." No name. She sat on the floor, back against the door, the note shaking in her hands. Tears came unexpectedly, not from relief but from the accumulated weight of everything she'd carried without realizing it. The next day, the man showed up again. No announcement, no warning. He found her where he always did, near the edge of things. "You stirred something big," he said. She exhaled. "I didn't mean to." He smiled faintly. "No one ever does." She told him about the email, the donor, the coffee shop meeting, the note. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Here's the part people don't tell you. Power hates witnesses more than it hates resistance." She absorbed that. "So what now?" "Now," he said, "you decide what you carry forward and what you put down." That night she slept deeply for the first time in weeks, because the story had twisted in ways she couldn't control, but not in ways that erased her agency, and because somewhere between resistance and reckoning, something rare had happened. The truth had been tested, and it held. They moved forward, carried by people who decided in ordinary moments not to look away. The last stretch of the story didn't arrive with relief. It arrived with quiet, the kind of quiet that follows turbulence, when everything looks settled but your body hasn't caught up yet. When you keep listening for impact even though the ground beneath you has finally stopped shifting. She felt it most in the mornings. She would wake before her alarm, sunlight barely touching the edges of the room, and lie still, cataloging the day ahead. Not out of fear, out of habit. Hyper-awareness lingered long after danger passed. Growth didn't erase instinct. It taught you how to live alongside it. The campus moved into its final weeks. Graduation banners went up. Seniors talked about leaving like it was an escape hatch. Underclassmen talked about staying like it was survival. The institution returned to its usual rhythms, but the undercurrent remained changed, like a river that had been redirected just enough to matter. She noticed something else, too. People no longer whispered when she passed, not because she'd faded into the background, but because she no longer needed to be discussed. She'd become part of the environment, not an exception. That was the real victory, when standing up stopped being remarkable and started being expected. One afternoon, she sat on the steps outside the building where the forum had taken place months earlier. A group of students nearby debated something trivial: music, plans, weekend noise, ordinary life in motion. A freshman approached her hesitantly. "Hey," the girl said, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "How do you know when to step in?" the girl asked. "Like, how do you know it's your moment?" She considered the question carefully. "You don't," she said. "You just know when you'll regret not doing it." The girl nodded slowly, like she'd been given something fragile and important. Later that evening, she packed boxes in her apartment. Books, shoes, the ordinary artifacts of a life in transition. She found the camouflage pants folded neatly in a drawer, the same ones she'd worn that day. For a moment she held them in her hands, memories pressing close. Then she folded them again and placed them gently on top of the pile. She wasn't leaving that version of herself behind. She was bringing her forward. Across town, the bully attended his final day of service. No ceremony, no speech, just a clipboard signed and handed back. The supervisor nodded once, neutral but fair. As he walked to his car, he passed a group of younger kids laughing loudly, pushing each other playfully. One shoved too hard, another stumbled. He opened his mouth instinctively, ready to laugh, to add noise to the moment. Then he didn't. "Hey," he said instead, "ease up." The kids paused, surprised, then adjusted, the moment dissolving without conflict. He stood there longer than necessary, unsettled. He didn't feel proud, but he felt different. And for the first time, different didn't scare him. That night, he deleted the old group chats from his phone. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just one by one. Clearing space. Growth, he was learning, wasn't loud. It was lonely and slow and necessary. The man watched a news report later that week about a different school, a different incident, eerily familiar. He turned the volume down and stared out the window instead. He knew now that moments like the one in the cafeteria were never isolated. They were part of a larger pattern, one that repeated wherever silence was rewarded and cruelty went unchecked. But he also knew something else. Interruptions mattered, even small ones, especially small ones, because they multiplied. On her final day, she returned to the cafeteria one last time. Not out of obligation, out of choice. The room buzzed with its usual noise, chairs scraping, voices overlapping, trays clattering. Nothing dramatic marked her presence, and that somehow felt right. She stood near the pillar again, Same spot, different person. She didn't replay the moment this time. She didn't feel the need to reclaim or rewrite it. The memory existed, but it no longer owned her. She watched as a group of students waved a new kid over to their table, as someone spoke up when a joke went too far, as another student quietly sat beside someone eating alone. No one noticed her watching, and that was the point. Outside, sunlight spilled across the walkway. She took a deep breath and stepped into it, feeling the warmth on her face, grounding herself in the present. She didn't know exactly where she was headed next. None of them ever really did, but she knew what she carried with her now. Not just strength, not just resilience, but clarity. She understood that justice wasn't always dramatic, that growth wasn't linear, that doing the right thing didn't guarantee comfort, but it did guarantee alignment with yourself. She understood that bullies weren't born powerful. They were trained by rooms that stayed silent, and that rooms could learn new habits. She understood that intervention didn't require perfection, only presence, and perhaps most importantly, she understood that her story wasn't about humiliation or revenge or even victory. It was about interruption, about the moment someone decided that what was happening in front of them mattered more than staying comfortable, about the quiet courage it took to say, "This stops here." As she walked away, she didn't look back, not because she was running, but because she had grown beyond needing the past to define her future. If this story made you pause, if it reminded you of a moment you witnessed or wished you had handled differently, carry that with you. And tell me something. From which part of the country are you watching this story?